I'm Fredrik Gertten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks, and we are back. We're out in the air, Leilani. And today we're going to meet an amazing person, the global economic correspondent of the New York Times, Peter S. Goodman. I mean, that title is like, wow, it's cool. And so, Peter, welcome to Pushback Talks.
Thanks so much for having me.
And you are here because you've been writing an amazing book that both me and Leilani have read. Normally, we don't read books because it's too much. but this time we actually did it. And it's the Davos.
Bravo for that.
Davos Man, the billionaires who devoured the world. Devoured, I don't know.
How the billionaires devoured the world.
How the billionaires devoured the world. So the billionaires are doing something to the world, Peter.
They certainly are. They are dominating our global economy, taking a system that, was never perfect. We could always find things to complain about in terms of the equity. But from 1945 till about the mid-70s was actually doing a fairly good job in most major economies of creating new opportunities for huge numbers of people. Now, I don't want a time machine back to 1975. We've made a lot of progress in all sorts of areas that we want to hang on to. But in one key regard, that period is special in that the gains of capitalism, the gains of economic growth were by and large transferred to working people commensurate with productivity. Everybody got a piece of the action. Wasn't perfectly fair. It wasn't ideal. But in that key regard, there's something that we need to get back to, because in the years since, the world's most powerful people, the people I call Davos Man, this billionaire set that operates across jurisdictions, challenging their allegiance to any particular country, people who can literally hire lobbyists, lawyers, tax accountants, by the dozen in multiple jurisdictions at once, have rigged the system so that the money now flows overwhelmingly into their own coffers.
Interesting, Peter, because I did this film Push, where Leilani is the superhero, and for us, that making that film was also a journey into understanding the setup and understanding that the financial crisis 2008 kind of created this super landlord Blackstone. They really did things. And I remember we had a screening at the Castro in San Francisco, that amazing theater. Yeah. Sold out, a lot of people. And a young lady came up to me after the film and said, Fredrik, I feel less lonely now, because now I know it's not my fault that it's so hard to live in this city. And actually, when I talked to Leilani now, after reading your book, she said the same. I feel less lonely now, because now I have Peter S. Goodman at New York Times telling the same story. Isn't it like that, Leilani?
That's a wonderful story. I'm sorry, go ahead, Leilani.
No, that is absolutely my experience of reading your book, Peter. I have to say, if I had to give a little, one-liner about your book, compulsive and compulsory reading. And for me, I'm Leilani Farha. I'm an advocate. I'm working here from my basement. I was the UN rapporteur on the right to housing, but that position itself, people look at a little bit strangely. So when I would talk about this stuff, especially I think actually there's a gender dimension here.
Sure.
As a youngish seeming woman weighing in on big finance and saying these guys are owning the world, they are running the world. People look at me like I'm crazy often. And your book is like all the details, all the proof, all the evidence of what's actually happening around the globe. So I have to say, it was an amazing read. It was a total page turner. I was like, every page, I'm like, what's next? What's happening next? And a huge contribution, in my opinion, a huge contribution. So
thank you so much. I think it's interesting that you say, not to put words in your mouth, but it's like it reveals this thing that's been going on that we've all sensed. I think, it's important to note, I'm not laying out a kind of puppeteer conspiracy. It's not as if, there's some dark room. I mean, there is the World Economic Forum at Davos, which plays an important role. But, even there, it's not like there's some master detailed plan. All this stuff has actually happened in plain view, but it's happened so steadily and gradually. I mean, it's a little bit like climate change, right? Like we can, if we're scientists and we're actually measuring water levels by the millimeter, then we're paying attention. If we're looking at thousandth of degrees of temperature change over time, fine. But it's not until there's a big storm where suddenly everybody's basement's flooded, where people are having to go to high ground, where people are hungry in places where there used to be plenty of food, where we say, well, hold on, what's happened here? And we've had a series of crises in recent years between the global financial crisis, the austerity that's been imposed in much of the globe to ensure that, the richest people don't have to pay, but ordinary people who actually depend upon government services do. And now, of course, the pandemic. And so, all of this stuff that I'm tracing in this book has happened in plain view. You just have to put it together to get the picture. So I'm really glad to hear that it's resonated in that way.
A lot of these, you are pointing out, you're focusing on 5 big billionaires. It could have been 5 different ones also.
Definitely.
But these are really interesting. But for us, you focus a lot about Blackstone and their CEO and founder, Steve Schwarzman. When we started to do Push, Leilani and I started to talk to each other. We didn't know anything about Blackstone. They were totally flying under the radar for a very long time. And now you put a lot of focus on them. So have they changed now? Or is this, do they like this attention?
I don't think they like this attention. I think Leilani can tell you about her own experiences in terms of, their attempts to silence her. And in my own dealings with Blackstone's communications people. I should say Schwarzman never talked to me. I spent 3 days a few years ago in Beijing at this very high-level conference where Schwarzman and I both went off with actually something like 5 heads of state, other billionaires, including Pierre Omidyar, the eBay founder. We all went off to the Great Hall of the People for an hour with Xi Jinping. This was really quite an experience. And I was able to see Schwarzman up close. He doesn't like to talk to the press. He wasn't particularly interested in talking to me. He did bring me along with a contingent of people to go visit his Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, which is one of the most prestigious campuses in Beijing, and a place that he's used to highlight his cooperation between the U.S. and China while he's vacuuming up investment from Chinese sovereign wealth funds, while he's pushing out his own investments in China. So, this is not somebody who likes to engage with the world other than on his own terms. And he likes to project this sense, and this I argue in the book is quintessential Davos Man behavior. He likes to project his own undertakings as like a gift to the world. Like, it's not enough that he's making huge amounts of money. And, we should back up for a second. Steve Schwarzman is the world's largest private equity magnate. He's a huge real estate investor. He's worth roughly $30 billion. And, you guys ran into him, I gather, in terms of his investments in Europe and especially in Sweden, where he opportunistically entered the market after what we now call the sovereign debt crisis, and picked up huge swaths of affordable housing, jacked up the rents, evicted people, cut maintenance. And what I discovered in doing the book was, this is his template, right? I didn't discover this. Other people have written about this as well. But the foreclosure crisis in the States, he goes in and spends hundreds of millions of dollars buying up distressed real estate in the U.S., and then, flips all this real estate for a tremendous profit, which, I think for those of us who are accustomed to capitalism would say, well, that's how it works. People with money go find stuff to buy, then they sell it to somebody else for more money. But in his memoir and in his public speeches, he goes on about how, this wasn't about the money. This was this act of civic virtue. We went into places where houses had been left to the elements with, weeds overgrowing the lawns and rodents running around, and we fixed them up and fresh coats of paint. And as I say in the book, you can almost hear the soundtrack for this pleasing, life insurance commercial with some adorable golden retriever puppy romping around on a freshly cut lawn with a toddler. The reality is he starts this thing called invitation homes, which is an invitation for people to pay exorbitant rent, people who don't have the money to just easily pick up and move somewhere else, also not by accident. I mean, he's very savvy at finding people where there's engaging in transactions where essentially there's a clear power imbalance. He's got the money, he's dealing with people who are just kind of making it paycheck to paycheck. They can't just go out and go rent some other apartment and come up with a security deposit. So he jacks up their rent to levels at which they can just manage, but he's getting the maximum. He cuts maintenance. It suddenly becomes impossible to get hold of anybody if you have a plumbing problem and an electrical problem. And this is the template that we've seen around the world, which is how you guys got on the trail, as I understand the story.
Yeah. We started off with Blackstone buying a lot of foreclosed housing in the US and in Spain and on Ireland. The Sweden story we didn't even know about, but Leilani was invited to Sweden and we did maybe we should have a check. And then we found this story. So they've been totally flying under the radar. And since then, we've been going to country to show the film, and we always ask people, "Do you know if Blackstone is in your country?" And people most of the time say, "No, they are not here," and they are always there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, absolutely true. They're everywhere. And this whole model that they use and that the other billionaires use, the extractive industry model, using finance to extract more wealth, is ubiquitous. It is the way it is. And in the housing world, it is the model now. So the damage that Blackstone has done isn't just within their own holdings. It's that they've established a model that is accepted. And all these other asset management firms and private equity and hedge funds and et cetera are using the same model. And so the damage is so huge. Blackstone is everywhere, but the model is everywhere. And this idea that they are saving the world. I mean, that's how they responded to me when I wrote what are called the Blackstone letters. When I wrote to Blackstone to say, hey, I think you're violating human rights here and you can't keep doing this. They replied and just said, and you put that in your book, what are you talking about? We are providing housing for needy families and we have saved the world.
We're the solution. We're the good guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that they say again and again. And, I'm not even attempting to demonize Blackstone or any other company controlled by some billionaire. I mean, it seems safe to say that if we live in the market system, and the market system has, all sorts of benefits, right? It's a very good way to find out what a fair price is. If it's a real market with the regulator ensuring that there's transparency and everybody gets a shot, then the market system is really quite vibrant. And it's a tremendous source of innovation. And we should be grateful that the market system has provided all sorts of, modern innovation. But we've got to have democracy. I mean, we can't be in a situation where the Blackstones of the world, the Steve Schwarzman of the world, can take the winnings from their business ventures and then use them to warp the rules of our democracies and essentially undermine processes that have put in place. I mean, Sweden, I think it's shocking for a North American audience to, confront the reality that this bastion of social democracy, everybody knows, 500 days of paid family leave when you have a child, and, the hospitals are open to everyone, and education's free. And I mean, I've had serious economists say to me, boy, if you're born in Sweden, you have won at life. And that's our image. And let me be careful. Like, in a lot of ways, that's actually true. And there's a lot to the Swedish model that is quite vibrant. But, Blackstone goes in and they clearly undermine the notion of affordable housing. And in so doing, they contribute to the same sort of breakdown in faith, in leadership, in authorities, in the whole notion of collectivism that's at the center of the Nordic model. The understanding that we all get something out of society. And it's a violation of the concept of society. I mean, I was really struck as I spoke to people who'd been living in these Blackstone-owned housing projects on the outskirts of Stockholm, which is seen, I think, also shocking to people who don't know Sweden, has seen, a housing bubble, the likes of which, I mean, we're talking San Francisco levels, beyond London, New York. I mean, there's less affordable housing in Stockholm than there is, in that bastion of easy rent apartments, New York City. I mean, that's a stunning thing, and that did not happen by accident. So, these people who've been living in what were once, modest middle-class homes who suddenly, discover that, no, they're actually living in financial assets that are being traded by these entities. They're not called Blackstone, by the way. They always have some, local name to kind of shield scrutiny. And suddenly their home, where they've raised children, where they've lived their lives, is revealed to be this kind of security, a chip by which, people like Steve Schwarzman are making the next, $1 billion. And that has just a kind of debilitating, it's like an existential crisis for people to learn that this system that they've had faith in is really not built for their interests. It's built for interests who are far away and much more powerful.
Melanie, democracy, is that the answer?
Well, I'm interested to explore what it means to say that democracy or a return to a kind of democracy might be the answer. What are the elements in that? Of course, I'm a human rights lawyer, and so what I am wondering always, my pursuit is, how do we, or shouldn't we, use human rights and the legal obligations states have committed to and made as a way to ensure capitalism doesn't run amok, to ensure a more tame capitalism that includes social well-being and economic well-being as part of the way it runs, the way it goes. So I was wondering, Peter, if you had ever turned your mind to that, because you do say in the book at the end, in the sort of solutions part, that part of the problem with capitalism right now is it's not, I mean, you don't use these words, and my apologies, you're far more eloquent, but, part of the problem with capitalism right now is that it's not being regulated, it's not being tamed or sufficiently, regulated to ensure good outcomes.
Capitalism speed, we call them, or on steroids.
On steroids, that's right. Yeah. And so I wonder about the power of human rights to do what you think needs to be done.
Well, first of all, I think we need to actually take back this idea of capitalism, because I think we've absorbed in most major economies this idea that what we've got, that's capitalism. And if you're against it, then you're a Bolshevik. What we have is not capitalism. What we have in most major economies, certainly in my own, in the U.S., is a kind of welfare for billionaires, a kind of, bailout mentality where, therefore, whatever ideology works to get the next rescue crafted their way. They want free markets when they're in a position to dominate those markets. Free market is usually like a term they throw around to defend themselves against a regulator who might look askance at their monopoly power, at their tax avoidance strategies. And then the rest of us get rugged individualism. That's not capitalism. Capitalism requires a market participant who is governed by a regulator who's making sure that there's fairness and transparency. So I do think we need to reclaim that idea along. I've spent a lot of my career going back to the dot-com bubble, where I remember, I would write about the telecom deregulation in the States, and suddenly cable companies were rebuilding the old Ma Bell monopoly in the States. And if you questioned that, if you ask, well, how does the consumer benefit from, now, once again, having to deal with one company? I'd be told by lobbyists, oh, you're anti-business. Really? So being pro-business is accepting that whatever the monopolists want to do is great, and anybody who asks a critical question is I'm pro-business. I'm for small businesses. I'm for, multiple participants, and I'm for people who are at the center of our democracies applying their power to influence the nature of our markets so that more people actually benefit. That's not, that doesn't turn us into Venezuela. I mean, Davos Man would have us believe that we either accept the status quo, where there's tremendous inequality, huge numbers of people left out, can't afford drugs, can't afford to send their kids to school. In the States, you're one emergency away from turning the lights off in your house and sleeping under a highway overpass. And either we accept that, Davos Man tells us, or, well, we might as well be Venezuela. And, we got to give up Uber and Google and central air conditioning. We can go dumpster diving for our dinner. That's not how life works. And the Nordics actually prove that, right? I mean, the Nordic countries are full of people who will say, listen, we don't protect jobs, but we protect workers. We have safeguards. And then we let the market determine, the inefficient companies should disappear. Companies with better ideas should triumph over others, and people will lose their jobs. But that's not going to be like some sort of death sentence. Like, you'll get some help from unemployment, you get trained to do something else. If you need help with your housing, we'll take care of that, because we need everybody to participate. And the tragedy of a situation where companies like Blackstone have turned, real estate into a kind of casino where only a handful of people win, is it's undermined that kind of faith, which has created an opening for, extreme right-wing parties like the Sweden Democrats, who are now running around saying, why should we pay taxes for immigrants who are never going to work? Like, that idea only works politically if huge numbers of people have already experienced a loss of faith in the society that they thought they were living in.
Oxfam the other week published a report saying that the world's billionaires, your friends, the friends in your book, they have doubled their wealth during the pandemic. So the richest people on the planet has doubled their wealth. Have they? I mean, normally we say we should reward people who do good stuff, who invent new things or so. Have they brought something new to the table for the world to make that all that money?
They're the beneficiaries of the rescues launched by just about every major economy during the first wave of the pandemic, when the markets were recoiling in horror. And central bankers and treasuries put a lot of money on the line to boost asset prices. And billionaires own assets. So, not to denigrate. Look, Jeff Bezos is worth $200 billion. We can argue about whether anybody should be worth $200 billion. Clearly, Jeff Bezos is a very bright guy, really hard worker, recognized a tremendous opportunity to alter our shopping experience in a way in which consumers really appreciate, right? Like, we all enjoy the convenience of click here and something shows up at our door. And during the pandemic, that probably saved a lot of people's lives and allowed those of us lucky enough to work, via Zoom, who don't have to go work in a slaughterhouse or empty a bedpan in a senior home. That allowed us a certain degree of normalcy. Thanks for that. You should be rewarded for that. But not to the extent at which the people working in your warehouses are actually having to choose between their paychecks and their health. It's not that Bezos is prospering while his warehouse workers are prospering not so much. That's the problem. It's that he's prospering because the people who work in his warehouses are prospering. And it's the same, Schwartzman's billions. He's actually said publicly the pandemic has been this wonderful opportunity to jack up people's rents. People are helpless. We know that Schwartzman's made a huge amount of money on investments in healthcare in the U.S. and especially in emergency rooms. Hey, that's a good place to be. A casino operator will tell you that you make money in a darkened room where people don't know what time it is and they're drinking a lot. Well, in an emergency room, people are not always, in the best position to ask, what's going to happen in terms of my health insurance policy and who exactly is treating me. They're going to sign the paperwork that's given to them so they can go get assistance. And people like Schwartzman have exploited that fact to jack up profits at the direct expense of the resiliency of the healthcare system for everyone else. So, you look at something like the 10 richest people in the world have doubled their wealth in the course of the pandemic, and it's clear that that is not an accident. That has happened because they had already put in place a system that ensured that every time something bad happened, someone would proffer a huge rescue, and they could use their lobbyists to influence those rescues to ensure that the asset holders, got the lion's share. And that's exactly what's happened during the course of the pandemic.
You said something good here. I mean, you mentioned the lobbyists and the image they are fighting for. I mean, Davos is a place where also gives these people the light they want to have. Leilani, you are in love with this line, the cosmic
lie.
Yeah.
Used throughout, yes. Maybe Peter can explain to our listeners what the cosmic lie is. I think this is a huge contribution that this book makes to this world, because if you don't understand the cosmic lie, then you can't address what's going on. So please explain the cosmic lie.
So the cosmic lie is this idea that Davos Man has insinuated into our political discourse and our reality, that when we organize our economies around making it easier for the people who already have all the wealth to get more of it, when we cut their taxes, when we deregulate, that this will spur, innovation and growth, and that will trickle down in the form of higher wages and better opportunities for everyone else, something that in reality has happened 0 times. And, we try it again and again. And part of the problem is that in our media discourse, we're, tempted to ask, well, why do people still believe in this lie, if it's clearly a lie? Well, no one actually believes in this. I think Davos Man's skill, one of Davos Man's great attributes, is the ability to kind of make the narrative true in his own mind. And we see this again and again at places like the World Economic Forum. We see this in the halls of Congress in Washington and in legislatures around the world, including in the UK, where I was living when I wrote this book. But, Macron comes in as the president of France. And the first thing he does, not by accident, because his campaign was underwritten by people like Bernard Arnault, who, is sometimes the world's wealthiest person, depending on fluctuations in stock prices. This is the guy behind, Louis Vuitton, Dom Perignon. He owns Chateau Yquem, the famous Sauterne winery, and he loves to wander around waxing poetically about wine and playing the piano and finding new ways to not pay his taxes. And he underwrote Macron along with a bunch of other billionaires in France, understanding that Macron, who's a consummate Davos Man, I call him a Davos Man collaborator. He's a guy who worked at Rothschild, the giant investment bank. He's very comfortable in Davos. He speaks perfect English. He projects this sense that France is over its days of being anti-business, and to his credit, has talked about how we're going to deal with long-term unemployment, which is a serious problem in France, and has grounded the idea that a strong France, an economically strong France, will strengthen the European Union at a time when Brexit has hurt European unity. But the first thing he does is he cuts taxes on the richest people in France. And then he follows that up by increasing gas taxes, and probably not really understanding, I'm willing to believe, his own country. Because if you live in Paris, which is a city with fantastic public transportation, you can get around quite easily on a bicycle, on the metro, on the bus. The rest of the country actually looks a lot more like the United States than people might think. People have to drive to get to work. There are a lot of people working these, crappy temporary contract jobs. Full-time work has been downgraded to temporary jobs. And as one person put it to me, we're just essentially going to work to buy gas so we can put it in the car and burn it to get to work. I mean, that's our life. And Macron comes in and he cuts the wealth taxes, he increases the gas taxes, and the result is the conflagration that we now know as, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement, where pretty much every working person in France puts on a yellow construction vest and goes out and says, hey, this is going to play really well with your friends at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Oh, you're saving the world through, addressing climate change. we're not dealing with the end of the world. We're dealing with the end of the month. And Macron, of course, has to walk this back. But, this is just another example among many of the cosmic lie. And the cosmic lie is alluring because it's great for the donor class. It's a fairy tale that politicians can trot out as justification for rewarding the people who actually underwrite their campaigns. And, what they want, and we saw this, with Trump in particular, who, was fulminating against, monkey-wrenching globalization, attacking the liberal world order, pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, saying all of these incredibly offensive, racist, misogynistic things. And yet Davos Man focused like a laser on the thing that Trump could actually deliver, and that was this enormous package of tax cuts. And so people like Steve Schwarzman continued to support him, would actually apologize for him, would wander around telling people, there's not a racist bone in his body, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The cosmic lie is the central organizing principle by which Davos Man convinces us the government is not necessary. Government is full of bureaucrats. We're wasting our hard-earned dollars. And if you let Davos Man have more of it, we'll all benefit.
Yeah.
Just a detail, Steve Schwarzman actually got one of the finest medals in France of another president, Sarkozy. So he's like the knight of something in France. So he's a big friend of France.
Yeah. Just on the cosmic lie, it's so in the housing world in which I operate, unfortunately, this idea is so entrenched. It's lower property taxes, make money super cheap so that these guys can come in and either purchase or build and solve the housing crisis. And we know that what they actually do is they take the money and they run. They may build, but what they're building is not affordable social housing, housing for those who are most in need. But they use that cosmic lie is so entrenched in how housing is dealt with. That's one of the strengths of this book that I now am literally, Peter, I'm going to be bringing your book to all of these meetings I go to and say, excuse me, like, here is the cosmic lie and you're proliferating this lie. Sorry, Frederick, go ahead.
No. I like where you're going. So, but I just want to bring in another cosmic liar into the game because there we have Blackstone. But then there's BlackRock. And BlackRock has been portrayed as a friendlier version of Blackstone, more environmental, responsible, and blah, blah. And I hear a lot of people talking about that. And then BlackRock has been giving a lot of responsibilities here in Europe for, Leilani, you know a lot about this.
Well, and the book details a lot of this. I have to say, when the pandemic struck, and I noticed, of course, all the central banks, regional banks lining up monetary policy and basically quantitative easing or, putting money back into the economy. I was trying to track it and follow it. And I noticed, I live in Canada, I noticed that BlackRock was being hired by all of these governments and banks to help set monetary policy. And I'm thinking, excuse me, BlackRock that has an interest in like every listed company, BlackRock with tentacles everywhere that is really working for the shareholder. We're allowing BlackRock to be the consultant to all these governments. So I say these things and people think I'm crazy and what does she know from her bunker? But maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of BlackRock with governments and what they've been up to.
Yeah, I think BlackRock is an institution that we all need to understand a lot better than we do. Bill Cohen is a former investment banker turned journalist, once referred to Larry Fink as he's like the Wizard of Oz. He's the guy behind the curtain. He's someone who has been under the radar for many years. He's the world's largest asset manager. So he manages $10 trillion in investments. A lot of this is passively invested in index funds. He's very effectively vacuumed up pension funds from around the world, university endowments, and he runs a whole series of investments. He's got exchange-traded funds, these sort of mutual fund-like instruments made up of baskets of stocks. And because he controls so much money, he's been able to track the flows of money, and he's a real kind of tech nerd. He lost a job early in his career at First Boston, where he actually helped pioneer the mortgage-backed security because of a data entry error, a kind of problem in his model, and there was a big jump in interest rates that he wasn't expecting, cost the company like $100 million. He was disgraced. So since then, he spent a lot of time on modeling and technology, and he's built up this product that's now purchased by funds that collectively control $20 trillion worth of assets. It's called Aladdin. What an ironic name. It's supposed to give these guys, it didn't predict the global financial crisis, but it's supposed to give everybody a view in real time, an alert system of changes that should concern us in the movements of money, interest rate increases, geopolitical problems, whatever. And so people pay good money trusting that Larry Fink supposedly knows more about flows of capital than anybody else. So not by accident, after the 2008 financial crisis, he's hired on to essentially be Uncle Sam's chief financial advisor. And then he repeats the trick in the bailouts of the first part of the pandemic, where his company, BlackRock, is hired to determine which securities the Federal Reserve will buy to bolster the market. Now, I think, Leilani, you are not alone in decrying a enormous potential conflict of interest because, first of all, BlackRock controls 5% of something like 95% of all the stocks that make up the S&P 500. This is, as I say in the book, like the whole notion that we're supposed to look to Davos Man to save us is kind of tragically hilarious because, the World Economic Forum operates under the mantra committed to improving the state of the world. And members of the forum, like Larry Fink, are, of course, the greatest beneficiaries of the status quo. They have every incentive to perpetuate the status quo. And they use this idea of stakeholder capitalism, this idea that, Milton Friedmanism, where companies are just supposed to maximize shareholder returns, and through that, the markets will do their magic. No, that's over. Now they're catering to stakeholders, labor, the environment, society in general, local communities. Fink has been front and center pushing this idea, and I argue in the book that that's really a kind of prophylactic against people wielding democracy to impose rules that would alter the status quo, redistribution of capital. So Fink comes in March of 2020. He once again gets the gig to determine what the Treasury what the Fed is going to buy. Investors understand that a lot of that money is going to end up in BlackRock's own exchange-traded funds. So they start putting their money in ahead, realizing that those funds are going to go up. They do. Fink gets more. Now, that itself is not such a big deal for a company that controls $10 trillion in assets, but the value of seeing behind the curtain at the Fed, that, it's hard to put a price tag on. And we've subsequently learned from the contracts released by the Fed that while BlackRock makes this big deal of fending off accusations of conflict of interest by saying, no, there's a clear barrier, there's clear separation. Our people who are working for clients, they're in a whole separate part of the operation. It turns out they can send people over to the Fed side of the curtain, then they can bring them back to BlackRock's normal profit-making channels after a 2-week cooling off period. That's just laughable.
In this podcast, we earlier had a guest called Sarah Chase, who was a correspondent in Afghanistan. She wrote a book called Thieves of State about corruption in several countries around the world. But her latest book is on corruption in America. And she talks a lot about the kleptocratic networks. And it seems like what you're describing now with BlackRock and Blackstone and all these very close relations with the politics and this and institutions are, it seems, very corrupt.
I mean, most of what I write about in my book is flatly legal. I mean, these guys are geniuses at manipulating the democratic system so that they can do what they want. I mean, everything that I've just told you about Larry Fink, that happened straight up in public view through the processes of review. The contracts were publicized. I mean, one of the things that's kind of amazed me, last year at Davos, Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of a big Silicon Valley software company called Salesforce, actually said, CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. And he said, the government didn't save you. We saved you. We gave you vaccines and credit to stave off bankruptcy. And we did it not for profit, he said, but to save the world. And the astonishing thing about this, and Benioff is a complex character who actually does run a lot of philanthropic enterprises. He did put his own money into a San Francisco ballot initiative that jacked up taxes for companies like his own to fund services for homeless people. He took a stand against the state of Indiana when they passed a law that would have discriminated against LGBTQ people, threatened to pull investment out of the state. I mean, he's a guy who does walk the walk more than most. But, in a couple of years where his company has made billions of dollars in profits, he has paid the modest sum of $0 in federal taxes. Flatly legal. He's exploited these loopholes that were put in place by the Clinton Treasury that allows American companies to transfer their intellectual property somewhere else. Ireland is a popular place, and then lease the use of that intellectual property back to their main business in the States and set those terms so high that on paper they're not making any money at all and paying profits accordingly. I mean, you could say, Benioff would be a fool to not avail himself of that loophole. But, it's worse than that. He's a member of the Business Roundtable, which is this lobbying organization in Washington, once headed by Jamie Dimon, who's another character in my book, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He's part of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I mean, these are entities that have lobbied aggressively for things like the Trump tax cuts. So, this culture of corruption, it's happening in this is not like greedy CEOs with suitcases full of cash, buying off corrupt leaders somewhere. This is greedy CEOs, holding fundraisers that we can all see with our own eyes. This is greedy CEOs going to Davos and pontificating about how there are saviors and we can count on the billionaires to solve all of our problems, which is, just another way of selling us the cosmic lie and telling us that we don't need to regulate and we don't need to collect taxes. We can see it all.
Leilani, it seems like, when you read Peter's book, it's like this feeling of there is a little group of guys who kind of run the world, control the world, and extract values from everywhere. Mm-hmm. How do you see this, Leilani?
Yeah, absolutely. And the book is really good at giving you a sense of the world in which they operate. And they all know each other, and they're all trading assets back and forth. And, this company was once owned by BlackRock, and then it's going to be invested in by Blackstone later. And, it's mind-boggling. And they all live. We had on another podcast, Aaron Glantz,
sure,
who wrote the book Home Wreckers. Yeah. And, he talks about how half of these guys live in the same building on Park Avenue, referenced in your book as well.
And Park, yeah. No, Aaron's book
right.
was very useful to me. That's a great book, and people should read it.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's that club is that it's part of what makes all of what you've just said actually around how legal everything is, how they're just availing themselves of the laws. Actually, it's part of what makes it so difficult to bring this down, because they always have that response. Sorry, folks, but I'm well within legislation here. And there's a number of things that make it so hard to bring this down. You had mentioned, I want to go back a little bit if you don't mind, Frederick and Peter, but you had mentioned stakeholder capitalism. And for me, it's so troubling because one of the real central things about human rights is that it's about human beings. And in order for governments to do human rights properly, whether it's local government or national level government, they have to be meeting with everyday people and ensuring that the decisions they're making, that they have a say in the decisions that are being made about their lives. And stakeholder capitalism is a way for these guys to say that they're kind of doing what human rights says that you should do, right? They're saying, oh, yeah, we're talking to unions, we're talking to tenants and tenants associations and et cetera. And it's, of course, that's all window dressing. It's not done properly. It's actually not done. And so anyway, only to say there's all these threads that make it so difficult to bring this stuff down. Frederick.
No, I just wanted to add, we've been talking a lot about Blackstone buying into an oat milk company here in my town, Oatly. Right. And that's a company that sells themselves as being extremely planet friendly. And they claim that they kind of, by letting Blackstone in, they actually change Blackstone, which I don't really believe. But what I'm thinking of both BlackRock and Blackstone is that they're so big, so they're actually sitting in boards of thousands of companies. So actually, if they would like to save the planet, or if they would push for worker safety, they could do it because they're actually sitting on a lot of power in a lot of companies. But they don't do that. That's kind of...
Well, Fink certainly claims to have that power. Fink sort of talks both ways, right? If you pin him down and say, well, actually, 75% of my funds are passive, meaning they're just in giant index funds where, oh, you want to buy the S&P 500? Then you have to buy shares of 500 different companies, whoever they are and whatever they're doing. Though at the same time, every year, and he recently put out, his most recent version of this letter to CEOs, where he has said, if you don't get right with climate change, the market will punish you and withhold capital. He has threatened to use votes to ensure that management's put in place that's friendly to his ideas about climate change. He gets a lot of ink, and now he's actually getting a lot of pushback from the right. So people are throwing around this term woke capitalism to accuse people like Larry Fink of, taking his eye off the ball of shareholder maximization, which I'm convinced is totally validating to Larry Fink. Like Larry Fink and the other proponents of stakeholder capitalism love that they're being attacked by the right for being woke capitalists because it validates that they're actually doing the things that they're not actually doing. Because in fact, Larry Fink has funneled $15 billion in capital to Saudi Aramco to help to build a natural gas pipeline. He's one of the largest, his company, BlackRock, controls huge shares in JBS, this Brazilian meat packer that's clear-cutting the Amazon. I have this whole story in my book about how, Larry Fink, in the midst of the pandemic, is squeezing Argentina in the midst of crisis where poverty's on the rise, the government doesn't have money for basic services, and Larry Fink is heading the largest, most powerful group of bondholders, demanding an extra, several pennies on a dollar in debt repayment on the bonds, knowing that there are going to be debt workouts with developing countries around the globe. I mean, in places like Zambia, Ghana, Pakistan, they're actually cutting healthcare services in the middle of the pandemic because they have to prioritize paying back the bonds to Davos Man. And at the head of that movement is Larry Fink.
And also the environmental organizations have checked on BlackRock and found that they are not using their influence to push the right things. That's I've seen a report around that.
That wraps up the first part of our conversation with author and New York Times journalist Peter Goodman. We'll be back next week with the second part of that conversation, where Peter, Frederick, and I will discuss how the pandemic has been used to make the ultra-wealthy even wealthier. Peter's book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, is available online and in stores now. It's a must-read if you want to understand who owns the world. See you next week for more with Peter Goodman on Pushback Talks.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks or follow us on social media at make_the shift and push_the film.